Good evening and welcome to Good Without God, our roundtable discussion of ethics for freethinkers, which is our roundtable discussion of ethics for freethinkers, which is presented jointly tonight by the Secular Humanist Society of New York, by the Reasonable New York consortium of 11 New York free thought organizations, and by our hosts in this historic building tonight, the New York Society for Ethical Culture. I'm John Rafferty, President of the Secular Humanist Society of New York, and this is our very distinguished panel. In alphabetical order, they are Michael Dora, who is Executive Director of the Center for Inquiry in New York City. In addition, he is Director of CFI's Office of Public Policy and is the organization's representative to the United Nations. Michael received a master's degree in political theory from Brooklyn College and a bachelor's degree in rhetoric and communication from SUNY Albany. His graduate research focused on the nature of public discourse on moral beliefs and values. He now maintains the blog The Moral Perspective and contributes essays on political and moral philosophy to Massimo Pigliucci's blog Rational Speaking. Dr. Klaeysen is clergy leader of the New York Society for Ethical Culture and ethical humanist chaplain at Columbia University. A graduate of the Humanist Institute, Class 10. She also co-mentored Class 15 and is now co-dean of the Institute. Anne was leader of the Ethical Humanist Society of Long Island from 2002 to 2008. She holds a Doctor of Ministry degree from Hebrew Union College, master's degrees in Business Administration from NYU and in German from SUNY Albany, and studied at the University of Würzburg in Germany. Massimo Pigliucci has a PhD in evolutionary biology from the University of Connecticut and a PhD in philosophy from the University of Tennessee. He is currently chair of the philosophy department at Lehman College and professor of philosophy at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. His research interests include the philosophy of biology, the relationship between science and religion, and the nature of pseudoscience. Professor Pigliucci has been elected fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and has published in national magazines such as Skeptic, Skeptical Inquirer, Philosophy Now, and Philosopher's Magazine. He pens the Rationally Speaking blog, rationallyspeaking.org, hosts a podcast by the same name, and publishes the 5-minute philosopher videos on YouTube. His most recent book is Nonsense on Stilts, How to Tell Science from Bunk, and his forthcoming book is The Intelligent Person's Guide to the Meaning of Life. Roy Speckardt is Executive Director of the American Humanist Association, based in Washington, D.C., where he actively promotes the humanist perspective on progressive political issues. He's a columnist for the Huffington Post and Patheos.com, has appeared on CNN Headline News, Fox News, numerous national radio shows, and he has spoken to dozens of local humanist groups across the country. Roy also serves as a board member of the Humanist Institute and the United Coalition of Reason, and as an advisory board member of the Secular Student Alliance. He holds an MBA from George Mason University and a BA in sociology from Mary Washington College.
Are we out of time already?
You know, I heard myself there. I'm starting to sound like one of those background announcers at the dog show.
Well, thanks for the comparison, man.
The wine model is a family friend. Before we attempt to define humanist ethics, let's clear away any religious debris. While many, if not most people, certainly most Americans, consider religion the foundation of ethics, most, if not all the people in this room, would agree with David Tribe in the current issue of Free Inquiry, who writes that secular humanists agree that religion cannot be the basis of morality. Differing moral codes from religion to religion, sect to sect, and generation to generation, negate any universal moral law upheld by the eternal, unchanging deity, unquote. In other words, let's all agree that there's no hall monitor in the sky making sure we stay in line. We're interested in being good without God, so let's get to it. An ethic, according to the American Heritage Dictionary, is a set of principles of right conduct, a theory or a system of moral values. Ethics, used with a singular verb, is the study of the general nature of morals and of the specific moral choices to be made by a person. Moral philosophy. So let's get your personal definitions. What are human ethics? And let's start with our card-carrying philosopher. Massimo?
What are humanist ethics? Actually, I'm going to start by disagreeing right off the bat with what you quoted. That was from a Free Inquiry article, is that right?
Yeah.
Let's do it this way. There. Better? Yes. So I was saying that I'm going to start by disagreeing actually with something that that John quoted. Can you reread the quote for a second? Or maybe I can.
The top paragraph.
The top paragraph. No, not that one.
Turn it off. No.
The one about yeah, I'm going to disagree with whatever, but I think the gist of it was, if I understand you correctly, the gist of it was that the difference between religious ethics and humanist ethics is that religious ethics tend to be different from sect to sect and from religion to religion, and it's also supposed to be, of course, invariant over time. I think that's true to some extent of ethics in general. I mean, fundamental ethical principles, I think, are common to all humanity. It's just that they're expressed in different ways. We think of them as coming from different origins, from different sources. Obviously, a humanist doesn't think that God decides what is right and what is wrong. But fundamentally, we all agree pretty much on the same kinds of things. You know, we all agree that going around killing people at random is not a good idea. Not at random, we disagree. There may be some good reasons to kill some people, especially if they're attacking us. But normally, we think that stealing is not a good idea. We think that lying, unless there are extenuating circumstances, is not a good idea. Betraying people's trust is not a good idea, and so on and so forth. These are pretty much universal ethical principles that each religion and each humanist philosophy tends to then rephrase and accommodate to particular circumstances, but I think they are actually universal. And the reason I think they're universal is because ethics is a way of thinking about how to behave in a social interactions, how to relate to other people in a way that is constructive for society. So we get our basic ethical instincts from the fact that we are social animals. And so it doesn't really matter whether you believe that those principles come down from above, from below, or you just think about it. It's pretty much all the same stuff. Now, of course, it is true that different religions do have then a lot of other precepts that are very specific and very different. You know, don't eat meat on this particular day, don't eat meat from animals that have that particular conformation or the other. Those are arbitrary. And those are variable from society to society. But you know, secular societies have the same kind of thing. I mean, we make rules about not, you know, don't engage in jaywalking, for instance. That's pretty arbitrary, you know, and then varies from society to society. And if you don't have traffic lights, that rule doesn't make any sense. So there's a distinction between fundamental ethical principles, which I think tend to be general, universal, and they are just a matter of, if you're a human being, you better behave in certain ways in a social context. And then there's the stuff that actually is in fact variable, cultural, changes over time, and so on and so forth. I think the major difference, and it's also not true, I think, that religious ethics doesn't change over time. They just don't want to admit it. They just don't like to say that things change, but they do. I mean, we were having dinner earlier, I was having dinner earlier with friends, and the topic came up of things that, you know, the Catholic Church, for instance, has changed over time. That certain things, you know, if you engage in certain behaviors like eating meat on Fridays, you will go to hell, until a few years ago. And then all of a sudden you don't go to hell anymore. Which of course raises the interesting question of what happened to those people who made the mistake before the rules were changed. I was suggesting that they would be rescued. But one of the people that didn't disagree, now they should stay down here now. So those things also religious ethics does change over time. It's just that typically that is not something that religions, organized religions like to admit. Secular humanists have much less trouble with the idea that ethical principles are things that need to be accommodated with the times and need to be changing as society changes. But I think the foundations are the same.
Roy, does leading national humanist organization have a definition?
Well, for us, I think it's important that we look at what everyday people think of as ethics, because that's when a definition has its most value, when you look at how people interpret the word when it's said. And philosophically, ethics is principles of good behavior, and good morality is living according to those principles. And that's important. Also, I agree with what Massimo said about how there are different types of ethical standards, some that are universal in nature, and others that change from religion to religion, secular group to secular group. However, humanists in particular embrace the idea, not just are more open to it, but really truly embrace the idea that we should revisit our standards, revisit our conclusions based on any new evidence that comes in, reanalyze and decide what's best for the world, how best we can improve our lot in the world and the lot of those we care about. So that's a little bit of our perspective.
We're in the house of the movement founded on ethical principles. Anne, what do you got to say?
Well, ethical culture is a religion of ethics. And that can be a little confusing, not only for people who visit us for the first time, but also for other humanists. And we were talking earlier, Michael and I had a wonderful opportunity to rehearse. So we were on WBAI this afternoon. And I think so often we have different labels, religious humanist, secular humanist. And those labels can tend to keep us apart. So what I really appreciate about this evening is that we're all together in the same place, at the same table, and seeing what common ground we have. Because ethical culture was started in 1876 as a religion of ethics with the intention of finding that common ground. The understanding that religion divides us, beliefs divide us. And if we could look beyond those beliefs, which keep us in our separate tribes, in our separate groups, and we could look to see what we have in common, and recognize that in general we want to be good people. At least human beings have the capacity for both good and evil, and my opinion is that ethics comes in when you make that choice on how to behave. So we understand that as human beings we have that choice. And when we are intentional about our ethics, and when we engage in a process of ethical discernment about what is right and wrong, then we're experiencing ourselves as ethical people. So why do we call that a religion? Well, we call it that because there's something really, excuse the word, we were talking about language and vocabulary, but there's something quite sacred about life and about relationships, and we don't know how we got here. We don't know what's going to happen, although I love what Ralph Waldo Emerson said. As a transcendentalist, we like him a lot. And he said, we are such stuff as stars are made of. And that works really well for me. I don't need to have a life hereafter. I don't need to be rewarded. I'm rewarded enough and punished enough if I don't behave well. So I think also we have this sense of morality being aboriginal to us as human beings. If any of you have children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, remember being a 2-year-old, you know right away what's right or wrong. One thing that I remember my son said one day when he came home from school was, so-and-so hit me in the playground for no good reason. Now, that's not about him having learned because he didn't, learning about a supernatural being. That's from his own experience that, if you're going to hit somebody, you better have a damn good reason for it. So I think that we, as human beings, we understand that kind of tension that we have within ourselves. And so another reason that we express that through a religion of ethics is that we understand that within a community, within a congregation, we can practice ethics, that we really can encourage and deepen those relationships we have with each other, and we can make it very intentional.
Michael, the Center for Inquiry's representative. No? Yeah.
Yeah.
Center for Inquiry's representative in the UN. How does the world see humanist ethics, and how does an ethical humanist like you see the world?
Well, thank you, John, again, for having us here. Broadly speaking, I think I understand humanist ethics in a very similar manner to Massimo, Roy, and Anne, and that they represent an ethics that values and upholds things like reason, justice, and empathy, and puts before pretty much anything else the human condition and the earthly condition before anything else that might be going on in the universe. Now, I should note that while I think humanist ethics are very important, especially given that I was raised as a Catholic, especially given what's going on in America right now, pulling that up on religiosity, humanist ethics are very important in that we can go out and tell people that there are actually really good reasons to be moral. You don't need to depend on your faith in God or your faith in a holy book. But there are some shortcomings to humanist ethics as well. I actually don't know if I would term it as shortcomings, but in a sense I see humanist ethics as a launching point for more specific moral or ethical debates. So you can be a humanist, but you are not necessarily in line about whether or not morality is, absolute and objective, or whether morality is a little bit more relative than that. And you can certainly subscribe to various different ethical theories: consequentialism, utilitarianism, virtue ethics, deontology, duty-based ethics. These things are not spelled out in any sort of humanist holy book anywhere. It's up to you to kind of decide which one makes the most sense. Now, my personal opinion, they all make a decent bit of sense, and I view ethics more, I think, like Massimo, as a toolbox instead of just one theory over all others. And these are important debates about which ethical theory puts us in which situation. But we can't get there without an initial secular humanist approach to ethics. These ethical theories are pretty much outside of the bounds of, say, religious ethics as normally defined. Now, unfortunately, the world, America, but the world in general is dedicated much more so to theistic ethics. I say theistic because, and I know ethical culture considers itself a religious humanist society. The world is much more dedicated to theism or other sort of supernatural ethics than humanist ethics. At the same time, I do think that, as Massimo suggested before, most people around the world are good for very basic reasons. Most people don't go in for religious calculations before they do good acts. They may think about morality through the lens of their religion, but I think most people do morality, or are moral people, simply because it comes to them innately. And I think the key for us is to push these people to more explicitly accept their humanism. I can't tell you how many times I've done these sorts of things where I have religious people come up to me afterwards and say, well, gee, I believe in God, and I'm pretty sure there's an afterlife, but I don't really think about morality in reference to God in the afterlife. I think about morality actually, just because it's good to do good. And I never really thought that I was a humanist before, but I guess I am. Can you recommend any books or blogs to read? These are the sorts of things that we need to continue doing, humanists in the room, continue doing to get people to realize that humanism is out there and a viable alternative. Now, just briefly in regards to the worldly scene, John mentioned that I do work at the United Nations, and the interesting thing about the work of the United Nations is that often Americans think about humanist ethics in relation to the culture wars in America. So humanist ethics in relation to debates about abortion and marriage equality, and some of the other hot-button debates, stem cell research and things of that nature. And certainly in relation to God, the Bible. The thing about some of the work that I do at the UN is that humanist ethics actually form the foundation for political rights around the world. The most important is freedom of expression and belief. There's been a concerted effort at the UN in the past 10 or 15 years by Islamic countries to get laws put on the books and well, at the UN get resolutions passed that would stifle freedom of expression and belief. And so humanist ethics in that position plays a critical role in defending the open society, defending liberalism and democracy. And that's something that is not, I'm not talking about abortion and stem cells and things like that. I'm talking about very basic civil rights and political rights around the world. Humanist ethics is crucial to that. Fortunately, I report that we have made some success at the UN. In fact, the UN Human Rights Committee just released a new statement that said that blasphemy laws, for instance, are incompatible with current UN law. That's a big win for us because we've been working on this issue for 10 years. Of course, this is going to continue to be an issue, but my whole point here is that don't view humanist ethics just in relation to what's going on in the US or what's going on in New York City, what's going on in Oklahoma, but think of it outside of the box. Think of it as a worldly ethic that can ensure very important rights. Thank you.
Okay, we have a definition of humanist ethics from secular humanism's erstwhile pope, Paul Kurtz, in his Affirmations of Humanism. He wrote, "We believe in the common moral decencies, altruism, integrity, honesty, truthfulness, responsibility. Humanist ethics is amenable to critical, rational guidance. There are normative standards that we discover together. Moral principles are tested by their consequences. Do we agree? For instance, I have questions about whose guidance? How do we discover the normative standards together? In other words, who decides?" And the teaching of ethics goes on in this building. Can we start with your thoughts?
Sure. Well, the teaching of ethics does go on here, and part of it is not about presenting a tome that has all the information in there. I think that's one of the many things that distinguishes us from theistic religions. And I just want to pick up on something that Michael said, talking about thinking outside the box. Please think outside the box in terms of religion. Look past the first definition. It's not always the worship of a supreme being. We have a great deal in common with Buddhism, for example, and Taoism. It's a way of life, and it's an expression. And sometimes it's, one of my colleagues, Joe Schumann, spoke about having a religious temperament. Not everyone has it, not everyone needs to have it. But I think we need to be careful in terms of our vocabulary, our definitions, because people find expression in different ways, and certainly those members here in ethical culture find that expression in a religious way, in the way that they define it for themselves. And so I think that's the key to it, is that we all, as thinking, feeling human beings, can come to our own decisions about things. I think another thing that distinguishes us is that there are some, not just religions, but some ideologies that refer to a very rigid, hard set of guidelines or rules. And I think that takes something very critical away from the individual who isn't involved in the process of ethical discernment for themselves. So, for example, my children went to the Sunday school at the Brooklyn Society. We have a program here as well. And we started off with something very basic. How can you be both kind and fair? And children can really take that on because they know that there are times when you are kind to someone or someone's kind to you, but it's not necessarily fair. Also, you can be fair in a particular situation, but it may not feel like kindness. So you can start with the experience that children have about that and get them to talk about it. I was also raised Catholic. The Baltimore Catechism, who made you? God made you. Why did he make you? To know, love, and serve him. We don't do that with our kids, and we don't do that with our adults. You come in already being a moral animal and already having those experiences. So how do you process those experiences within a community? How do you learn about them? But I will also say, as I said this afternoon, we do take some very strong moral stands on issues. And you know, one of my favorite expressions is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And as we're in a time right now when we're really called to take a moral stand on what our values are and how they get expressed in economic terms, as well as political terms. So I think what we're about here is the exploration in community of what is the right thing to do in different situations. And our founder, Felix Adler, who, by the way, was only, I would often say, only 25 when he started this religion of ethics. And he was trained to be a rabbi. In fact, his father's synagogue was right across Central Park, Temple Emmanuel. And his feeling was that ethics is more important than ethnicity. And that we need to move out of our tribes, we need to move out of our comfort zones. He didn't use that expression, but that's what he meant. To move out of our comfort zones to really appreciate the diversity in other people. And to recognize that each one of us has a unique gift that we need to share. And I think that may be one of the many things that kind of distinguishes us. There are some individuals who feel they don't need to share, that they know everything. And you know, and they have a, you know, they really.
Why were you looking at me?
I'm not looking at, no, not at all. But I think, and I'll close this down, I'll give you a chance. But I think what we have to understand is that everyone has something to offer, we have something to learn from everyone else. So we don't have a sacred text per se, although we love the New York Times, but we love to argue with it. But what we do have is this experience of one another and saying, how can I be a better person? How can each of you help me to be a better person?
Continuing on the subject of values and normative standards, and besides, somebody else?
Yeah, I'd like to add something. So a couple of things. First of all, I noticed from your quote from our Pope, Paul Kurtz I, that basically he sounded to me like a virtual ethicist. Which it's fine with me. Now, Michael mentioned a few minutes ago that there are different canonical standard ways of approaching ethics in moral philosophy. There is utilitarianism, which is a type of ethics that looks at consequences of actions. There is deontology, which is a type of ethics that looks at the kind of duties that we have toward each other. The most famous one of which is Kant's categorical imperative, you know, don't do anything that you wouldn't want to do done to you, essentially. And then there are a couple of others. One of them is virtue ethics, which goes back to Aristotle. And the thing about virtue ethics is that it's very different from the others in one fundamental respect. And if you notice what John said about Paul, quoting Paul, you will see the hallmarks of virtue ethics. The ancient Greeks did not ask the question, what is the right thing to do? They asked the question, how are we to live? Which is a very different kind of question. You know, what kind of person am I supposed to be? Not what kind of actions or what kind of things I'm supposed to do, because the idea was that it's all about character. It's all about who you are. And then if you're the right kind of person, if you're a virtuous person, which is why it's called virtue ethics, then the right actions follow. So you don't ask yourself, what's the right thing to do? You ask yourself, how am I supposed to be a good person? And the quote from Paul is, in fact, a list of virtues. You know, integrity and honesty and all that sort of stuff. He wasn't telling you, don't lie or don't steal or something. It was telling you, be a virtuous person, be a person of integrity and so on. I think that is actually a much better way of approaching ethics in general. My second point was this. Your question was, you know, who's going to decide how we're going to find out about ethical principles and all that. There is a really interesting sort of method that is widely used by philosophers, and I see no reason whatsoever why it couldn't be used by everybody. It's called reflective equilibrium. The idea of reflective equilibrium is that when you're pondering an ethical dilemma, an ethical problem, an ethical issue, you will start automatically with certain assumptions. You have certain background beliefs. And then what you're going to do is you're going to think about how those beliefs, what those beliefs are going to tell you about a particular situation and how you feel about the situation in respect to your beliefs. And if something goes wrong, you think about it and you start changing either your reactions or your fundamentals. Let me give you an example, otherwise it gets too theoretical. Suppose that you have a friend who believes the following three things. A, that the Bible is inerrant. B, that children should not be killed. And C, that lying is a minor offense. It's a rather minor offense. It's certainly not a capital offense. The UFOs are landing. And then you say, well, but wait a minute. The Bible says that if your child lies to you, you should stone him to death. Okay? Now, that person now has several options available if he engages in reflective equilibrium. The first thing he can do is say, no, you're lying. The Bible doesn't say so. Well, it's easy to verify. Just Google it, go to Wikipedia, whatever it is that you need to do. The Bible does say that. Okay, so once the factual matter is set aside, now he has different choices. He could say, okay, then I'm going to modify my belief in the inerrancy of the Bible. I'm going to say, given these things, given this particular situation, I'm going to drop my belief in the inerrancy of the Bible. That's one way to do it. Or he could say, I'm going to modify my second belief. I'm going to actually change my mind about the fact that children shouldn't be killed. It turns out the Bible is right. People should be killed. Children should be killed under certain conditions. Or I'm going to change my third belief, which is lying is not a capital offense. Well, it turns out that lying is actually a capital offense. He can do any of these three things. He has a choice at this point. In order to make his ethical beliefs more coherent, he has to change at least one of these three things. Okay? That's what the process of reflective equilibrium is about. That you start looking at situations in your ethical beliefs where there are contradictions, where there are things that don't work well with each other, and you start saying, okay, since they're not working well, which one am I going to drop, or which one am I going to modify, and in which direction? And the idea is that this is a never-ending process. You don't actually reach an equilibrium, but it's a reflective one because you have to think about it. Of course, that assumes that you want to be coherent about your beliefs. If you don't care about being incoherent about your beliefs, then you got bigger problems than thinking about the Bible.
Who wants to take it? All
right. The idea of who decides what's good has unfortunately been dictated to us to some degree since ancient history by those with power, either in government, in religion, and other aspects of society. And it's only a relatively recent historical phenomenon that we see ourselves being the arbiters. And and from a humanist perspective, we see that it's important to be guided by reason, inspired by compassion, informed by experience, when we're looking at coming up with what we see as knowledge, or epistemology, or whether even we see what the source of morality might be. And as Anne talked about earlier, I think it's really instructive to look at young children. For Jean Piaget, in his psychological studies, found that kids develop morality at a very early age. He looked at kids playing marbles, and he found that the earliest children who would pick up those marbles and hadn't had any experience with taught morality or faith, they'd just play with them, chew on them, that sort of thing. But then once they started to play together and follow the rules that they saw the older kids playing, without any regard for, they didn't even quite understand them, they just do their best to imitate. But then, once they got a little older, they worked together to develop those rules, to figure out, oh, well, this is the consequence for breaking the rule. This is the consequence for following the rule and being successful or whatnot in the game of marbles. And eventually it became very similar to our modern system of law, the kids, the way they played marbles. And it really shows us this experiment process that Jean Piaget did, that we are natural rule-creating animals. And it's just natural for us to come up with these rules, and we can see them in society today, not always in strict moral sense, but even those who religiously follow football can recognize that rules on Monday night are very important.
Michael?
This question, who decides morality, is one that I'm sure most of you in this room have heard before, somewhere in a book, on a blog, or in person. Perhaps from someone who's religious, who is having a hard time understanding, well, now that I don't have, a holy book to go reference, or, church leader to go reference about morality, who's the one deciding morality? First, I think this notion is completely wrong, because even religious people need to decide what's right and wrong. God simply does not command them to do things. They have to decide that what they think God's commanding them to do sounds like a reasonable thing. Essentially, we all have a conscience, and we all have to decide what's right and wrong. So I think, on its face, that's a wrong type of argument to make. So that's on a personal level. The question of who decides morality then becomes obviously us, and that goes at a personal level to a societal level. We collectively decide what's moral and what's ethical. Now, this can be kind of scary for some people because it can go really wrong. For instance, you can have societies that decide people who are black should be slaves to white people. You can have a majority of society that decides that that's a really good idea. Those people were clearly wrong to decide that. And I should actually note that a lot of them were justifying that with Christian dogma. But the point I'd like to make is that there were also a lot of people that said that's wrong. And we have the power to band together and come up with new standards of ethic, of new ways of doing things, and we can fight for it. We can make forceful arguments for it, we can write about it, we can rally for it, we can go lobby lawmakers to change their minds about these things. So, in some sense, it's scary that we now have the power to decide these things. In some sense, it's empowering. So that's the one thing I wanted to talk about in terms of guidance. The other thing I wanted to say is that, Massimo, maybe you missed the last sentence of Pope Paul Chris's quote.
Or I quote it selectively.
Moral principles are tested by their consequences, which in some sense is true.
Yeah.
But I don't think moral principles can always be tested by their consequences. I think there are shortcomings with, say, a purely consequentialist approach to ethics, and mainly for two reasons. One is that we don't have full control over all of our beliefs and actions all the time. Some things just go awry. We don't have much control over those things. And so that's one shortcoming with judging something purely by its consequence. And the other is that sometimes the consequences do not match the action. The one that's most recent to me comes to mind is the pastor down in Florida, Terry Jones, who burned a Quran. And I'm not saying to anyone in this room that you should go burn a Quran. In fact, I think you should go home and read the Quran and know what's in there, and then pass it around and have other people read it. I think that's probably the best thing to do with our books, not burn them. But the consequence of that was that in the Middle East somewhere, a bunch of Muslims were very disturbed by this, and unfortunately their anger was stoked by Muslim imams in their their area, and they went out and killed a couple of UN workers at a UN base. Now, should the consequences of that affect how we treat free speech and free expression in the United States? To me, absolutely not. I don't think we should ban people from burning books. Somewhere else in the world, many other places in the world, this does actually influence governments to restrict free expression, freedom of belief. I don't think we should do that. But I'm not going to get into a discussion of that. My point is that, again, the consequences are not always equal to the action of the belief, and the consequences are often out of our control. Terry Jones was not in Afghanistan. He was in Florida. He couldn't have controlled what happened. So I'll close with that. Thank you.
Before I go on to the next question, I'd like to, Massimo, you left out one possibility for the person who believes in Bible inerrancy. when his or her choices are challenged. There is always, and I think more likely than anything else, the standard answer, which is summarized in the title of an old Ring Lardner short story. Shut up, he explained.
That's right.
Anyway, what about, since we don't have a God or a list of commandments to guide us, are there any absolutes in humanist ethics, any moral imperatives, or are all our moral and ethical choices situational? And if so, is that a bad thing? Do we believe in evil, for instance? And how do we discover the good? Why do we have a conscience? Roy, you want to start?
You're in trouble now.
I think that for many, the concept of evil is something that can be consistent with humanist ethics. It's how you define it, of course. Whether you see this as something that's inherently negative for individuals, for society, and around them, that's an evil action. Some might define George W. Bush's invasion of Iraq as evil, because he did it on false pretenses, so he's lied about it. He did it with the idea of helping his buddies gain money and power, which isn't a very good motivation. And he did it at the sacrifice of so many lives and so many families, and in a way that has even affected us in a great economic way today. So you could see that as an evil action from a humanist perspective. But there's also those who think that evil is something supernatural in effect. And that wouldn't be necessarily the way a humanist would view it, that there's something that all good and all evil exists. Because humanists don't see the world in black and white like that. We see things, we notice the shades of gray that exist between those stark contrasts. Yeah.
Who's next?
I can go next. Okay, so I don't find the concept of evil particularly useful. I think it's simply a way to brand people who you profoundly dislike or disagree with, and it doesn't do any constructive work. Now, that said, I would say that certain things are bad, wrong, etc. But the word evil, precisely for those very heavy supernatural, mystical connotations, I would, if I were, I am a humanist, I was about to say, if I were a humanist, I would stay away from it. And since I am a humanist, I'm staying away from it. I want to address perhaps the more difficult part of the question, which was about moral absolutes, right?
Yeah.
I don't think there are moral absolutes. I do think that ethics is all situational, and I don't think it's a bad idea. Again, this actually does follow from my views about virtue ethics. If I were a deontologist, if I were a duty-based approach to ethics, then I would have to believe that there are moral absolutes. In fact, it's all about moral absolutes. If I were about a consequentialist, I guess I would also draw that conclusion, although perhaps in a more nuanced way. But as a virtue ethicist, I don't. I think that, the very same action, take killing somebody. Well, generally speaking, that's a bad thing, but there are situations in which this is actually not only not a bad thing, but in fact even the right thing to do. And the same goes for lying, the same goes for a bunch of other things. Now, the problem with situational ethics seems to be that many people, even including several people that I know in the humanist and skeptic communities, seem to equate situational ethics with moral relativism, and the two are completely different. They're not at all the same thing. So a moral relativist is essentially one who says, anything goes, culturally speaking. Your culture says that this is right, my culture says this is not right, and we just have to disagree. There's no way to adjudicate the difference. Basically, these are people who think of ethics pretty much like taste, or aesthetic taste, or tasting food. I like chocolate, dark chocolate. You like milk chocolate. How are we to adjudicate this? Well, I tell you, you're wrong. But other than that, there's nothing, I cannot come up with an argument for why you should be wrong or why I should be right. That's the idea about moral relativism. Situational ethics is different. The idea is that you have to justify, you still have to justify, you have to still use ethical reasoning, or that reflective equilibrium that I was talking about earlier, to decide whether this particular action is going to be, course of action is going to be right or wrong, but your decision does depend on the context, it does depend on the circumstances, and it may change if the circumstances are significantly different. Now, there are some things that I can hardly imagine under what circumstances they could possibly be justified, slavery being the obvious one, right? But again, that might be a limit case. Almost everything else that I can think of, it's a matter of, well, we need to see what the situation is.
It's an interesting question, the way that you're framing it. Is there something absolute? Is it relative? I'd like to frame it differently. And I think what's most important from my experience and as clergy here, the thing that I try to communicate is our shared humanity. And a situation like slavery happens when one group of people dehumanizes another group of people. And so I think as long as we hold on to the belief, however you want to put it, that we are all human beings and that we share this planet. And again, no matter what kind of science you rely on, no matter how you look at it, the fact is that we're here. We're alive. We have an opportunity to live good lives if we choose, to love other people, to be loved. And so my faith would be in that humanity, and that's why we say that it's an ethical act to choose to attribute worth and dignity to every human being. And that's I think that's a real act of faith in terms of saying that, maybe evidence to the contrary.
Even Ann Coulter?
I beg your pardon?
Even Ann Coulter?
Oh, that's a tough one, boy. Yeah. But you know what? I do. I choose to attribute worth and dignity even to her because I do think that she does have that. Well, let me just, I'm going to take, because you did that, I'm going to go on a quick little tangent. I love Felix Adler, our founder, and I often say this to my members. If you read his book, An Ethical Philosophy of Life, which is a little hard to, the language is a little tough to go through. But in his chapter on forgiveness, he has a very long footnote on what he calls intellectual enemies. Now, Ann Coulter is my intellectual enemy. But what he says about it, he defines an intellectual enemy as someone who, if their values and their beliefs were to be, say, that atmosphere or that system under which we would live, that we would find the very air difficult to breathe. And yet, he says, and here's the ethical challenge, and yet even they hold a piece of the truth from which we can learn. Now that's a real act of faith, because I frankly think she doesn't. So anyway, but I think that that's the ethical act that we take in choosing not to dehumanize others whose values are so antithetical to ours, who are indeed our intellectual enemies. And I think that's a real challenge for us. Now, are they ever going to change? I don't know, but I think, again, the faith is that they would have some kind of experience in their lives where they actually maybe would acknowledge that other people are intelligent as well. I think what we often suffer from is the lack of reciprocity. In other words, we're willing to accept that other people have different values and different expressions of what those are. But I think that very often we're running up, and I know that you and some of your debates and your panels run up against people who are not willing to concede that to us. And so I think even there, as humanists, we need to take that high road and say, I choose to attribute worth and dignity to every human being, and then extending it as well to our environment. Because it is an ethical issue, that whether we are going to sustain this environment for all of us or not, or whether this species is going to end sooner rather than later. So, enough for now.
So I think Massimo did a pretty good job of talking about absolute standards. I agree with him that there are no absolute moral standards. I think morality is much more a case of having rigorous standards and values and principles, and then oftentimes taking into account these situational facts and issues. You know, basically every single moral principle you can come up with is going to have some exception. That doesn't mean that moral principle is, you know, completely flawed and should be thrown into the trash bin. It just means that there are no absolute moral standards, and that we need to take into account a range of different standards when acting morally. Sam Harris, controversial figure, of course, when it comes to ethics, has actually compared ethics in some sense to playing chess. Now, I've never played chess before, actually. I don't know how to play chess, but after hearing that comparison, I read up on chess, and it actually seems like a decent comparison. There are certain rules that you want to follow to win a game of chess, but there are certain situations when you're playing chess where it's actually beneficial to not follow that rule, or where it doesn't make any sense to follow a rule. It could be beneficial to follow some other rules. So I think it'd be beneficial for us to think about morality in that way. As for evil, there's a really interesting book out right now by a psychology professor at Yale. His name is Simon Baron-Cohen. He's the brother of Sacha Baron Cohen, who I was actually watching last night, the movie Dora, which is actually a brilliant movie if you think about it in terms of exploring, you know, American culture. And anyway, Baron Cohen writes in this book, and there was a pretty good review in the New York Times a couple weeks ago, that he's really frustrated with how people usually treat evil. And he says that usually it's defined in some sort of supernatural terms, we're already talking about, or some sort of very scientific, psychological account of evil, or in what he calls frustratingly circular terms, which is that, well, he did that because he's truly evil, which is of course circular because, well, he's evil because he did that. You can get all sorts of things. So what he proposes in his book, and I just started skimming through it, is that evil can be scientifically defined as basically an absence of empathy and compassion. Seems like a pretty compelling and provocative thesis. I don't really know where I stand on it, but it could be. I know that there's been a big push now, you know, by many people to get neuroscience more involved in morality, and I know you have something to say about this, Massimo, but I do think that, you know, it can help us think about evil in, you know, more explicit secular and scientific terms than, you know, the way that people have thought about it in the past.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that this is the problem when neuroscientists try to do moral philosophy. I think that it is interesting, absolutely interesting, to study the neurobiological basis of anything, and particularly the neurobiological basis of moral reasoning and moral behaviors. Contrary to both Aries and apparently Baron-Cohen, however, I don't think that that tells you anything whatsoever at all about what is right and what is wrong and why. It just tells you this is what people, this is which part of the brain people use when they engage in moral reasoning, which is great. It's like, it would be like saying, you know, forget about taking a course on Shakespeare and critical literary criticism. Just let me show you which areas of the brain are engaged when you read Shakespeare, and that's all you need to know. Actually, that tells you precisely nothing about Shakespeare. Considering, as far as evil, you know, defined in terms of neuropathology, essentially, I find that concept actually very problematic. Because if you think about it, people who have that kind of neuropathology are actually sick. They're not evil in any of the standard senses of the term evil. They're just sick. I mean, they may need to be locked up because they're too dangerous to society, but they're still sick. So I think that's.
If I could just say, so I think Baron-Cohen is making a different argument than Sam Harris. I think Baron-Cohen is actually stating empathy is a really important thing for us, and that's, he's not making that on scientific grounds. He's just, you know, he's saying we need empathy to live in a sort of civil society.
I was just objecting to the word evil for psychopathology.
Okay, whereas someone like Sam Harris is making a more forceful argument for neuroscience deciding perhaps what's moral and what's not moral.
He should stick to playing chess.
I'm glad I brought that up, but we could probably talk that.
Well, you guys bring up there's one more thing that I want to put out there. That's just that, because you heard panelists, including myself, mention that there can be exceptions to rules. That everyone can think of very simple rules that you shouldn't steal, but then you could think of rules from from fiction and from real life, where Jean Valjean steals bread to feed a starving family, or you have people lying to save Jews from being captured in their homes in Germany. There's situations, certainly, where you can break rules. But the idea that you can break rules regularly, consistently, and have no consequences is a mistake. They can drain the character of the individual that is doing them. If you consistently lie, you eventually become dishonest. If you consistently are cheating or committing murder or something like that, your moral character has degraded to the point where you can no longer make good decisions as to whether or not you can break these rules. And then it can be a never-ending spiral downward until, I don't know, you might join a career in politics or something like that.
I agree.
John, I'd just like to add something about empathy, and I agree that to have a conscience, you know, it's important to experience empathy, and that uses this wonderful facility that we have for imagination, that we can imagine ourselves in someone else's position. We can, walk 2 moons in someone's moccasins. There are some people, as we know psychologically, who do not have empathy, who cannot experience it. That doesn't mean that they can't within a context, within a community, care about the consequences within that community. So somebody may not have, say, an internal conscience, but they may care about the particular community that they're in. And so I think sometimes for those people, having those outside rules and that authority that comes from outside is something that's important to them. In other words, not every sociopath does bad things. They may not have a conscience, they may not have empathy, but they may also not behave in an immoral way because they may be within a community where they're held to certain rules. So I think that rules can be helpful for those people, with a kind of psychological dynamic where they need to be within a community. So it may not be something internal. They may not be able to develop a conscience or ethical discernment or the intentionality about ethics, but they are bound by some rules. So I think that that kind of authority is not necessarily bad. And can be very good. I think the consequences, again, if you're within a particular community where, and let's just look at our economics. I mean, there are people who are doing very bad things, and yet if they're within a community where the consequences of that is that they get bonuses, and that they're held up as some kind of paragons of financial expertise, then again, where does the moral authority come into that? They don't think of themselves as being immoral. I recently talked with a gentleman who does some therapy with some corporate executives, and their morality is that my job is to make sure that our shareholders get their money, and we have no connection whatsoever with the social impact that our particular corporation has in that community. That's for government to take care of. It's something that, I don't want to mention Felix Adler too much, but I'll mention him one more time. He talked about spiritual pain being a divided conscience. And I think that we have a lot of people who are acting in the world because they need to make a salary, put food on the table, roof over their heads. They're behaving in a way that they can only behave if they have a divided conscience. Because as a human being, you've got to know the impact that your work within a corporation is going to have upon a community. And yet you convince yourself that what you're doing is moral because that's the mission of the corporation. So I think it's not so clear-cut in terms of ethics, because you can be within an environment where, what you're doing and the consequences of what you're doing are perfectly consistent. And yet if you look at it from a different perspective, you might call it evil.
Yeah, even Tony Soprano went to therapy, so, yeah.
Okay. First of all, thank you, Anne, for being the only one who responded to the conscience question. And the dialogue that erupted between Michael and Massimo, perfect. Well, thank you both, because my next question, and I'd like to deal with this one quickly, even though this is the most technical one, because we've got to get to really good questions after that. The one's about sex.
It's good. It's good.
This is about biology. So much has been made recently about, quote, the biology of ethics, unquote, or, quote, the biological roots of morality, unquote, and the supposed intersection of neuroscience and philosophy. And by the way, I say supposed so that Massimo won't hit me. Writers like Patricia Churchland and Sam Harris, both of whom are both neuroscientists and philosophers, quote, believe that reason and neuroscience can, and I'm quoting from a June 22nd article in the Chronicle of Higher Education now, neuroscience can replace woolly armchair philosophy and religion as guides to morality, unquote. So, can it?
Hell no. All right. So, all right, first of all, a couple of qualifications. Patricia Churchland is actually a philosopher with an interest in philosophy of mind and neuroscience. Sam Harris is a writer with a degree in neuroscience. He demonstrably knows nothing about philosophy. So here's the thing. I find that whole area of research actually fascinating, both the neuroscience of moral decision making, and actually you briefly mentioned right at the beginning of your question the evolutionary biology of moral decision making. There's quite a bit in evolutionary biology about where did we get our sense of morality, our sense of right and wrong. You know, what do other primates do under circumstances that we would call moral, that for us we call for a moral decision making. I think that all of that is both intrinsically interesting, fascinating, and sort of does in fact provide us with a unified picture of the problem of morality. But it doesn't answer at all moral questions. So it's very important to understand morality, a sense of morality in human beings is at the roots of biological evolution. It's a result of biological evolution. We are social primates, and like other social primates, we evolved the basic building blocks of morality, moral behavior. Why is that important? Not only it's intrinsically interesting, I think, as an evolutionary biologist, but it's important because it takes the mythology out of it. It takes the mysticism out of it. It says, oh, right, we engage in this kind of behavior for similar reasons to why we engage in sex or we eat food, because we're biological beings of a certain kind. Okay? For non-social animals, the whole question of morality makes absolutely no sense. If you're not social, there's no issue of morality. So that's important for that reason. The neurobiology of decision-making is interesting, and it's one of those fields at the interface between philosophy and neurobiology, because again, it's interesting to see what kinds of areas of the brain are involved in these kind of decisions, and it does help us make sense of certain things. So, for instance, one of the best examples of where the neurobiology actually helps is in the case of the trolley dilemma, which of course I know some people here may know what I'm talking about. You can simply not have a discussion about ethics without mentioning trolleys. So here we go. This is the trolley moment for the evening. So the trolley dilemma is a family of thought experiments, because philosophers like to do thought experiments. They're much less expensive than actual experiments. You don't need grants for it. And it's an interesting one because it's supposed to present people with a moral dilemma and see how people reason about that moral dilemma. The basic version of it, the basic two versions of it are these. Suppose you're looking at a tracks or where a trolley is going down and you see that the trolley is out of control, is about to hit and kill 5 people. You can avoid the tragedy by pulling a lever that just conveniently happens to be next to you. And if you pull the lever, the trolley is diverted on a different track where it's going to kill 1 innocent person. You know nothing about the people, you cannot do anything like shouting, they can't hear you, nothing. That's the only choice you have. You either pull the lever or you don't. And most people answer, about 80% of people typically answer, yes, I would pull the lever. Presumably the reasoning being, well, I'm saving 5 people and killing 1, there's a net saving of 4 lives, it's a no-brainer. Well, it turned out it's not quite a no-brainer, because then you can pose, the philosophers pose the question in a different way. They say, well, okay, now it's this exact same situation, except that this time you don't have the lever. You have a big fat man in front of you that you can push so that he blocks the trolley. Are you going to push the man? And now 80% of people say, no, I wouldn't push the man. Now that philosophically is kind of, you know, if you subscribe to certain kinds of ethical reasoning, particularly consequentialism or, you know, utilitarianism, it's puzzling. This is, well, what's the difference? You're still saving 4 people and killing 1. Why is it that you can pull the lever but you can't push the guy?
Because you don't really know if you push that guy, then it'll really stop the trolley.
Oh no, see, this is the beauty. This is the beauty of the thought experiment. You know, it's absolutely certain. You will stop the trolley. Now, that's where a couple of years ago, a group of philosophers teamed up with neurobiologists, and they looked at what happens in the brain when you're making those kinds of decisions, right? And it turns out that when people think of the first version of the trolley dilemma, most of what happens in the brain is they engage the frontal lobes. The frontal lobes are typically engaged in rational reasoning, okay, in logical thinking. But when you switch to the other version of the trolley dilemma, suddenly the amygdala in the back of the brain lights up and does most of the work. The amygdala is the seat of the emotions. It's one of the organs of the brain where, the parts of the brain where the emotional thinking really takes on. So really what's happening there is that you're switching from logical thinking to emotional thinking. You really don't want to push the guy, essentially. It becomes an emotional thing, and that's why people react differently. This is all very interesting. Notice that the only thing that the neurobiology tells you nothing about is, should you push the damn person or not? And there is no answer that you're going to find by looking inside the brain.
Could I just add something to that? Yeah. I love the trolley experiment, but one thing that doesn't come up is, what about altruism? What about throwing yourself off?
You can't.
You can. I understand you can't, but you know, but clearly, but you can in the thought experiment. I'm suggesting it.
Sure.
But I think what you're also getting at is something that moral psychologist Jonathan Haidt also talks about, and that is, pre-verbal and verbal morality and how we express it. And so the emotional one is kind of that gut feeling that we have. We have a gut feeling that something is right or wrong, and then, and so much of that, I think language, the development of language is also the development of rationality and reasonableness. And of course, we're all part of this reasonable coalition as well. But there is a part of us that's pre-verbal, that's pre-rational, where we have a gut reaction of what's right and wrong. And then where language comes in, it helps us to rationalize that decision that we've just made. And so we get into that as well. So again, we human beings are animals. We're very complex. We're social primates. And I think, again, we're dealing with sort of that gut emotional aspect, and then very often we'll do these things, and then we'll rationalize it later with wonderful vocabulary and language.
I see you've been watching a lot of Fox News recently.
Oh, God. The only time I watch Fox News is when Jon Stewart shows excerpts, because otherwise I'll get nauseous.
Let's consider morality with regard
Men
to
never
sex.
grow up, they're always adolescents.
Morality, again using the American Heritage Dictionary, quote, is the quality of being in accord with standards of right or good conduct, a system of ideas of right and wrong conduct, virtuous conduct. But David Tribe, also in that same Freethinkers article that I quoted earlier, writes, an objectionable feature of the Judeo-Christian Muslim moral purview is its obsession with sex, such that an immoral person is usually not taken to be one who is guilty of aggression, intolerance, untruthfulness, malice, greed, exploitation, but rather an immoral person is one who engages in sexual activity or depiction of sexual activity of which religionists disapprove. Is that why the word morality has become a pejorative among freethinkers, especially progressives? Is the liberalizing of attitudes towards sex and gender in the West during the last half-century or more of revolution, is that a result of more humanist attitudes, or are we just bystanders? Roy?
I guess I'd start with saying that morality isn't a pejorative term among progressives and humanists today. It may have been for a little while there when we allowed the religious right to take control of that word and use it, as John said, and to define sexual morality, a particular sexual morality, by a minority of Christians in our country who view it that particular way. But today, I think we've gone beyond that moment of fear and have reclaimed the word. Humanists can be just as moral as anyone else, with or without God. And so I don't think that issue is still on the table in the same way.
Yeah, I don't think it's on the table as much as it used to be, although I still do get people, I mean, I run a blog called The Moral Perspective, so obviously I'm a dogmas type, but I still do run across some secularists who are kind of weary of using the word morality. And the only reason really is that it had been co-opted by the religious right in the 70s and 80s with starting organizations called the Moral Majority and things like that. So, you know, the fact is morality exists, so to project this whole domain of experience really, to me, seems ludicrous. So I don't think it's really a problem that humanists face. Now, in terms of sex, because I think that's the most interesting part of this whole question here, I do think that the kind of liberalizing of attitudes towards sex and gender in the West, as John said, is a result of more secular and humanist thinking about sex and gender. I would not say necessarily, and this could just be a result of my experience. I'm only 28 years old, so I haven't been around for the liberalizing attitude very long. You know, I mean, much of it started decades ago. But I would not necessarily say that the liberalizing is, that you can trace it back somehow to organized humanism. I don't know how much organized humanism essentially was involved in this liberalizing. I think now, certainly more than in the past, because now humanist organizations are more prevalent, but that's fine. I mean, it's fine. Not everyone has to be involved in the humanist movement. As long as people are thinking humanistically, if that's a word, that's fine by me.
I have a couple of different approaches to the question about sex. The first one is that, you know, we're talking about situation, consequences. So I think the greatest factor in liberalizing sex in the West was the birth control pill. You know, once certainly Margaret Sanger did her damnedest in terms of birth control, but until we had something like the pill, and there's a reason that the Pope issued an encyclical against its use. So I think that, you know, that's a situational aspect. If you look at your consequences, well, the consequences are, and let's face it, the consequences fell more often on the woman than on the man. And so, you know, and of course, the talk about the moral judgment was made more often of the pregnant woman than of the father. I see a lot of heads nodding, right? So I think, you know, in terms of situational, it has to do with the consequences. So whether it's the consequences of becoming pregnant, or in the 80s, the consequences of getting AIDS. We're looking at, you know, what are the consequences of your behavior? So that's one part of it. The other part of it is, getting back to what I said about before, is it humanizing, is it dehumanizing? To me, sex is wonderful if it's an expression of love. If you are treating the other person as a human being, as someone whom you cherish and love, and you have a real relationship. I too often bring up my children, but I will again, because they always ask you about sex. And so I said, well, you know what, I could give you the facts and the information about sex, but here's the real deal. It's about a relationship. It's about how are you engaged with this other person, how are you enhancing that other person, and bringing out the best in that person. So I think part of it is biological, if you will. You know, what are the consequences in terms of your health? And in starting a family, and what are the consequences in terms of the expression of love. And I think what I find is the hypocrisy among so many of these conservative religious folks is that, you know, they talk about some absolute of chastity, and yet if you look at the statistics, you know, how many of their children are having children out of wedlock, and getting, married very young and a higher divorce rate, and how many, are really looking at, birth control and protecting themselves and saying, I'm in a relationship that's important to me. And, that's the way I look at it, both biological and in terms of the relationship.
If I could just quickly add to your point, I think there's a correlation between places where abstinence only is taught and extraordinarily high rates of teen pregnancy.
Yes.
Duh.
Yeah.
That's a fact that all stand on its own.
Okay, a couple of things about that question of sex, morality, and all that. First of all, I want to mention Jonathan Haidt's research. You mentioned him a minute ago. It's another example. Jonathan Haidt is a cognitive psychologist, and he's done some interesting research that I think speaks to this issue. And then I'm going to also use, however, as I just did with Sam Harris, that as an example where scientists should go up to a certain point and then just shut up. So Haidt has done some really interesting research, comparative analysis of the psychology of moral thinking between conservatives and liberals. Okay? And what he found out was that for liberals, morality is all about things like rights, it's all about things like fairness, that sort of issue. For conservatives, they do recognize rights and fairness, but they're less important. They have 2 or 3 additional dimensions of morality, as Haidt calls it. And these have to do with purity, patriotism, respect for authority, that sort of thing, okay? Which liberals simply do not consider as part of morality. They just don't consider those moral characteristics or moral issues. That's a fact, okay? That distinction is factual, and I think does explain quite a bit about the obsession of certain people on the Christian right with sex, because they see that as part of purity, as part of that area that liberals simply don't even see as a part of morality. That's the good thing about Haidt's research. The bad thing, of course, is he couldn't stop himself, and he went on and said, see, conservatives have a different and broader conception of ethics. No, I think conservatives are just wrong about what counts for ethics and what doesn't count for ethics, and they don't realize it, and they need to be educated. So that's one thing. The other thing is this, the distinction between ethics and morality. For most purposes, most of the time, the two are actually used as synonyms. They're, you're doing ethics, you're doing morality, you're doing ethical philosophy, you're doing moral philosophy, it's the same thing. There are some philosophers, however, that have drawn a distinction there, and the one that comes to my mind is Bernard Williams, who, again, was a virtue ethicist. And he drew the distinction between ethics and morality in a similar way as what I explained earlier is the distinction between virtue ethics and other kinds of ethics. So he thought that, say, utilitarianism and deontology deals with morality. They deal with rules. They deal with behavioral rules or certain things that have to be done, duties, rights, and things like that. Well, ethics is broader for Williams because it includes also character, and therefore it also allows for human psychology. The fact that we have emotional reactions to pushing fat people in front of a train, that is part of our moral decision making, and according to Williams, rightly so. Because, as you were saying a minute ago, yes, you can violate moral rules once in a while if it is absolutely necessary, but if you do it all the time, you use the word, you use integrity. That's right, you become a less virtuous person. So if you do want to distinguish between the two, then I think Williams' distinction is a useful one. Morality is the part that deals with duties and rights, what's the right thing to do, and ethics is broader, includes that plus the fact that we also make decisions based on character, on virtues, on psychology, and so on.
Just wanted to add, with the idea of how these changes have come about and whether organized humanism has had an impact on that, and I would say it probably hasn't, not because we weren't there already. In fact, looking back at history, American Humanist Association, the Ethical Society, were way ahead of the game. Before NARAL existed and Planned Parenthood was focused only on contraception issues, we were supportive of the right to choose. Before Harvey Milk's activism, we were supportive of same-sex marriage. Before end-of-life choices and Jack Kevorkian, we were supportive of end-of-life choices. So the idea that we were there, yes, but we didn't have the activism, we didn't have the numbers, we didn't have the public positioning that we're starting to gain today. And that's something that we're really seeing blossom over the recent years, and we're going to really be pushing in the coming years, so that we have a position to be able to move society in the progressive and humanistic direction we'd like to see it go.
I'm going to interrupt because I'm going to go ahead.
Well, very briefly, because I know you have a lot of questions, but I just wanted to add one thing about the whole, biological aspect of it, the scientific aspect of it, and I want to put a plug in for our weekly lunch discussions on Thursdays upstairs on the 5th floor at noon. The 2 articles that we're going to be discussing have to do with this. It has to do with what part of your brain lights up when you have these different decisions. The concern that comes out of a lot of this for a number of people is, how does free will play into this? And I think that the concern for a lot of thinkers, and I really appreciate, Massimo, that you said that still doesn't help us decide what's right or wrong, but I think one of the dangers of this is when we think about being determinate, that we're determined by our biology, is a concern is does that mean that we no longer have free will? And so I think however we fall in terms of the science and the biology of it, and I think this again comes from looking at it from a religion of ethics perspective and having faith in humanity. I think it's if you choose to behave in such a way that you believe that you have free will and that you can make a difference, I think that has some impact on us. And so, but I just want to mention that free will is a major issue as we're talking about this.
You should mention the event that you're organizing. Let another plug.
Well, I guess if we're plugging things then.
Yes.
The Center for Inquiry is going to sponsor an event this November about free will and neuroscience, and bringing both philosophers and neuroscientists to talk about how advances in brain science and scientific findings have shaped our philosophical concept of free will. And we're still finalizing that stuff, but you go to the website, centerforinquiry.net/NYC. In the coming months, you'll find out more about that.
That's great.
Is humanism liberal? Is it necessarily liberal? Should humanists, like religious fundamentalists, organize as a political force? Roy, does the AHA have a political agenda? Should it? Michael, how about the CFI and the Council for Secular Humanism? Roy?
Absolutely. We need to have a political agenda if we want to see what we've concluded to be the best course of action to be implemented. If we don't care about those things, we're not in the right place. So I think that there is an agenda, a progressive, positive agenda. It's not dictated by any political party, but it's based on reason and experience, the things we've been talking about, compassion, empathy, and these are conclusions, the best conclusions we can come up with based on the evidence out there. We're willing to reconsider them at every stage, but let's act on the conclusions that we have today, because that's the only way to make this world a better place. The second part of your question was?
Do you have a political agenda, and should it? And you've answered
the liberalism piece, yes. Is humanism liberal? And the answer to that, which will offend those folks here who consider themselves conservative, is yes, it is liberal. I challenge those of you who feel, I'm a conservative though, I have financial conservative ideas or what have you, or I don't agree on this choice issue or that issue or the other. Well, perhaps you don't. And perhaps you truly are someone who fits in the mold of the Republican Party platform, which says church and state should be melded, and that women should not have a right to choose, and that gays and lesbians shouldn't have equal rights, and things like that. Perhaps you are, but you're probably not, even if you call yourself conservative. And so today's conservative doesn't mean what it did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. It's really become a very radical idea. And humanists just aren't conservative today.
Eric Alterman, who actually spoke here many years ago, wrote a great book. It was called Why We're Liberals, and he uses the introduction to actually outline why most Americans are actually liberals, in the sense that you think about liberalism. And then from there, he goes into the disagreements they have about politics, but I think, you know, was it Stephen Colbert who said, you know, reality has a liberal bias or something like that? Now here's the thing. The Center for Inquiry and the Council are, you know, nonprofit organizations that don't get involved in political advocacy for candidates and things like that. And so we don't have what you might consider typical political positions. What we consider our political positions to be is based on ethics, basically. That we have certain ethical positions that have political consequences. So an example of this would be that the Center for Inquiry believes that everyone has the right and should have access to decent health care. Every human being should have that. Now, we can get into debates about how this actually should play out. Who should be providing these sorts of things in the absence of other people not providing these sorts of things. We can get into all sorts of interesting political debates about this, but we do think that it's necessary that human beings have access to these sorts of things. That, at base, is an ethical position, and again, we can get into political discussions about it, but it doesn't mean that the Center for Inquiry is now a liberal organization because we think people should have that right, unless, of course, you think the UN Declaration on Human Rights is a liberal document as well. Now, that being said, I realize that there's a lot of debate in the secular skeptic movements about politics. A lot of people are, you know, liberal, there's a lot of libertarians, there's some conservatives, and I think one way in which we might be able to go about dealing with this debate is kind of by sidestepping it and focusing on very specific issues that we all agree on. So instead of getting into debates about, you know, who's, you know, is libertarianism really the answer, or is liberalism really the answer? Should we all be Democrats, or is the Center for Inquiry, you know, taking a liberal position on this? I think it would be better if we all had a discussion about ethics and came to very specific conclusions about what we agree upon, what we don't agree upon, and then take those conclusions out to the world of public policy and try to work together on those things. So, you know, the answer is to focus on very specific issues, very specific debates that are ongoing, and not to get into these, you know, high-minded, broad debates about labels. That might be a way in which we can make some political progress in a world in which we're not all on the same political page.
And how about your organization?
Well,
let me repeat the question.
Okay, good.
Is humanism necessarily liberal, and should humanists, like religious fundamentalists, organize as a political force?
You know, it depends on how you define. I mean, if we're defining liberal and conservative in the way that you know, moral psychologist Jonathan Haidt does, I'd say yes, we are. If we're defining it in some, you know, political way, I would like to think that we can be more inclusive. I often will ask my members, do you think that a Republican would feel comfortable coming here on a Sunday morning? And if the answer is no, then we really need to be thinking about who we are and what we stand for. I think we have to understand that people do have values, and people who, you know, who are Republicans do have values. I remember years ago around the dinner table we were talking about something, and my kids said something about, oh God, I can't imagine that anybody would vote for Republican. And I realized, oh my gosh, what am I doing to my children? You know, how am I raising them if they think that just because someone's a Republican that they, you know, that they don't have values, and that we should honor and respect them? So I said, you know, kids, people are sitting around other dinner tables in other homes, and they have Republican values, to which one of them, I forget who, said, not in this neighborhood, Mommy, because we live in Park Slope, Brooklyn. But I think that, you know, I think, you know, you do have to take stands, but I agree with Michael, you need to take stands on where you can find the common ground. You know, abortion is often brought up, reproductive choice is often brought up. I think that what we can agree on is that no one should have to have an abortion. How can we work on a situation where that doesn't become necessary, where a woman doesn't find herself in that position where she finds no other way So I think if we could agree on that, then we could take it again out of sort of, you know, a moral judgmental place and say, you know, how can we make sure that every child is wanted, that we don't have so many accidental parents, but we have more intentional parents who want to be parents. And so a lot of that has to do with education, and of course you come into, you know, this abstinence-only nonsense. But, and that's judgmental because I think we do need to take a stand on these things. And I think, you know, where we take a stand here is we take a look at what are the social issues that we want to stand up for. So, for example, justice for juveniles. We had a series of conferences here to raise awareness about the situation that so many young people find themselves in and how the communities are being traumatized. And how can we play a role there, and how can we help with that? So I think, you know, we tend to over-politicize things in terms of political parties when we should be looking at, you know, where's that common ground and where can we work together on solving a problem that faces us as human beings and faces us in society. And too often we see it playing out right now. People, you know, they draw the lines, they circle the wagons, and that becomes their priority rather than, you know, how can we live together in community and you know, lead good lives, good and healthy lives.
Well, sure, I'm the only one that doesn't have an organization. Sure. I don't have an organization, so I'm free to say whatever the heck I want. Not that you guys were not, but so first of all, yes, I do think that the humanist movement in general is liberal in the broader sense, in the, if you want it, in the John Stuart Mill sense of liberal, as in we are about protecting people's rights and advancing social liberties and advancing social, the social contracts. We're about social justice, we're about healthcare, we're about education. However, you're right, it's actually, these goals are actually achieved, but those are important goals for us. I'm also kind of sick and tired, frankly, since I moved to the United States 20 years ago, finding myself sort of have to defend the label liberal as if it were somehow a dirty thing. I mean, you know, most of the good things that Western society has today is because of liberal politics. So, you know, stop defending it. That's the way it is. Now, I agree. If, however, you want to be inclusive, you might want to be careful about how you say it and all that sort of stuff. But as I said, I don't have an organization, so I don't have that problem. Now, one interesting comment I think Michael made very briefly earlier, which is, to me, that is one of the fundamental distinctions between being an atheist and being a humanist. I'm both, but when people ask me, what are you, you know, how do you label yourself? If you really have to label yourself, then my answer tends to be, I'm a humanist. I rarely say I'm an atheist. And the reason for that is because, of course, atheism is simply a rejection of a particular kind of belief for which there is no evidence and no reason. Fine. But it doesn't imply any particular positive agenda, certainly not any particular positive ethics, not any particular political position, and so on and so forth, which is why a lot of our friends are, in fact, you know, libertarians or conservatives and so on and so forth, if they are in the atheist movement or even in the skeptic movement. But that is one difference between humanism and atheism and skepticism. Humanism is, in fact, a philosophy. It isn't just a general attitude about reason and evidence, like skepticism, and it's certainly not simply a denial of a particular kind of, or a rejection of a particular kind of belief. So that is one major difference, and therefore, yeah, I would be surprised if somebody were to label himself or herself a humanist, and then all of a sudden tells me that she doesn't care about social justice or fairness or healthcare or education or that sort of thing. Okay. And sex. And sex.
Would John and Carlos go downstairs ahead of everybody else and start opening the wine? We can only do soundbite answers, but I'm going to answer one of them myself. No, I don't have to get nasty. Someone addressed this to Michael, but it really goes to everybody, because it's the ethical or moral dilemma. You know?
Right up
closer,
to you.
closer.
I'm sorry. Somebody addressed this to Michael, but I think it belongs to everybody. And please, just soundbite answers. It was wrong to enslave human beings But was it right to kill human beings in the Civil War to put an end to slavery?
Soundbite, yes. Essentially, dialogue only gets us so far. Sometimes there needs to be, unfortunately, war. There's just war theory and whatnot, but soundbite answers yes.
More soundbite? More soundbites?
Al, yes.
Any disagreement?
No.
Well, okay, so...
Wait, you can't disagree with yourself.
No, I mean, so...
On the one hand, on the other.
Of course, I'm not supporting any indiscriminate killing of people. I'm not supporting, murder, warfare. I'm not supporting dropping bombs on civilians, things like that, right? But that again is all within just war theory. So just to make that clarification.
Right.
Why are, that's 5-0, by the way, including me. Why are Americans so hyper-religious as compared to Western Europeans? And why are Americans so hostile toward people who don't believe in God, even if they are moral people? Soundbites, please.
Oh, the simple answer is the one that the British give you if you ask that question. They say that they sent their convicts to Australia and the religious nutcases to the United States.
I didn't hear it.
Oh, I'm sorry. They sent their convicts to Australia and their religious nuts in the States. But a more serious answer is perhaps surprisingly, in part, precisely because there is a separation of church and state in the United States. What that has done has fostered a healthy competition among religious sects and denominations and so on. The fact that there is no state religion, I think, is one of the major reasons why we have this situation in the United States and a different one in Europe. The second one, I think, is that America has never seen a religious war yet. While Europeans have had thousands of years of religious wars, and at some point they got sick and tired of it, and the alignment happened.
Well, and the founders of America had parents and grandparents who died in religious wars in Europe, and that's why we have a secular constitution. One of the things about humanism, free thought in general, is that it's sort of like the old joke about the shtetl. 3 Jews, 6 opinions. Same thing with us. And every time a couple of people disagree, a new movement is started. Someone here has asked the question that relates directly to that. How can humanist groups work together to counter the growing influence of the religious right and its deliberate deceptions?
One of the things we helped start and are supporting is the United Coalition of Reason, which is an idea of a fellow in Philly who said, there's 4 or 5 non-theist groups in this town. Why don't we get them together to have dinner and see if we can't get them to work together? And so he invited them to dinner, and it turned out that there were 4 more groups that we didn't know about that were also in Philadelphia. And then before you know it, it worked so well, he said, let's do this all around the country. And there's now 45 groups, including one here in New York. Yep. And I think this is one way that our groups are working together better than they've ever worked before.
In addition to that, and the New York Society belongs to the Reasonable New York Coalition, and that came out of the United Coalition of Reason. The other one is the Humanist Institute. And I'd just like to ask, because I know we have some folks here, how many are involved with the Humanist Institute in some way, shape, or form? Great. That's a place where humanists from different backgrounds come together and learn more about humanism and learn how to be leaders in humanism. And they come from a lot of different backgrounds. We have Unitarian Universalists, we have secularists, we have ethical culture, we have atheists, we have, it's just an incredible mix of people. And this has been going on for close to 30 years now. A group of people who got together and humanists and said we need to have a way to help people learn more about humanism, to train humanists to take on leadership roles. So check us out, the Humanist Institute, talk to those people who you saw with their hands up, and learn more about how to learn more about humanism.
I'm going to play devil's advocate here. I'm going to suggest that actually we shouldn't really do too much attempts at unification. I just said that the reason religion is so vital in the United States is precisely because there's a bunch of different ways of doing it, and a bunch of different people that disagree on how to do it, and that's a very vital thing. I'm not suggesting we should start fighting each other, but this idea that there has to be necessarily an umbrella or a coordination, nationwide or local, whatever. If it happens, it happens. If it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. I think the vitality of the movement is in fact in the fact that there are so many different organizations. There are so many different shades of doing humanism. There is also, of course, quite a bit of overlap between, among the humanist community, the skeptic community, the atheist community. There are several things that we agree with the atheists or the skeptics, and others that we don't. And it's perfectly fine that we have different organizations to deal with those different facets. So, yeah, collaboration is nice, but only up to a certain point. The other thing is, I think it could be, one argument can be made that it is intrinsically more difficult to have humanists and skeptics cooperate with each other because we pride ourselves in independent thinking. It's literally like herding cats. We're cats, we're not sheep. As the famous Monty Python Life of Brian says, we're not sheep. Yes, I am a sheep. We're not, so it's very difficult to do it.
Yeah, I agree with Massimo. I think we should be probably more accepting that everyone, or many people have different approaches to the issue. The soundbite would be, we're not opponents, we're all on the same team. Next question.
The most moral issue today is the wars that we're involved in. Should we, our various groups, join together in a stop the war movement?
I guess we got the answer.
Yeah. I think many of us are. I think that many of us are involved in that. So I think, that's the beauty of the diversity is that we find ourselves running into each other in other venues. I think, Michael mentioned before that we can come together on certain issues. And I think, coming together on the issue of war and peace is a place where we will often run into each other and find each other. But I want to just add another thing about the fact that we get along. I think we didn't always get along, and I think that the last, 15, 20 years, we've learned how to get along a lot better and to appreciate each other. And part of it has to do with the experience of seeing the conservative right coalesce around issues and being able to put their differences aside so that they can push a political and a social agenda through. So I think and unlike some religious denominations, we actually do share communion with each other. In the sense that we really can sit down, and we're going to be doing that afterwards, we're going to be drinking together. But we did a series about faith in action this summer, and it was so educational to hear from my Lutheran colleague right down the street here, who told us about all the divisions within Lutheranism, including Michelle Bachmann. She's part of the Wisconsin Synod of Lutherans, and they do not share communion with the kind of Lutheran that he is. So, I think we need to understand those kinds of differences. I think we tend to look at religion as being monolithic, not by a long shot. And I'd say that as a group, we get along a whole lot better than even the differences within Lutheranism.
I'm going to, once again, play devil's advocate or whatever, point part. And that is, I'm going to reject the premise of the question. I don't think that the wars that are being fought on behalf of the American people, allegedly, are actually the most pressing moral issue. Because they're the consequence of another, much more fundamental moral issue, which is that this country is becoming a plutocracy, no longer a democracy. This is a country that is now essentially being run by a small number of very, very rich people. If you guys have missed Jon Stewart's Thursday night analysis of richhood and poverty in the United States, go check it out, because it's absolutely powerful. Actually, it's brilliant. I think that is the moral issue. That is the fundamental moral issue, because without that, we wouldn't have wars.
Yes.
We would simply not be either in Afghanistan or certainly not in Iraq. And we wouldn't be doing a lot of other things that are actually ethically very, very questionable from the point of view of this nation. That is because we're becoming a plutocracy, and nobody seems to be caring, noticing, or doing anything about it.
I very much agree. I think that humanists advocate for progressive values and for equality for atheists, humanists, and free thinkers, and that's our shtick. You know, that's what we do best. And so that's what you're going to expect the most of what we're doing, working on church-state separation issues, raising the profile of non-theists in this country. However, you're certainly going to see us acting out on the issues that we care about, the ones we've talked about earlier today, as well as the war, which we're working on. In fact, I know we're going to be honoring Deborah Sweet at our conference next year. She's the head of World Can't Wait.
I mean, there's only so much that these organizations can do. Of course, I think all four of us up here, well, Massimo doesn't have an organization, but we would welcome.
I have an organization of my own.
we would welcome donations. I'm sure Massimo would welcome donations as well. I mean, there's only so much we can do with the amount of funding that we have. Even the biggest humanist organizations pale in comparison to the very big religious think tanks out there. So. I see many issues that humanists and secular organizations could take on as major issues, but there are only so many things that we can focus on. And so we try to kind of look at the ones that really fall in the domain of your interests and what logically falls out of your philosophy. So I'd like to see these organizations probably take more into account about war. There are other issues like the ethics of non-human animals, vegetarianism, things like that. I think we really need to get more involved now with bioethical issues that are going to become more prevalent in the future. But yeah, there are only so many things we can do, and I would actually, and this is not the official position of the Center for Inquiry, but I would agree with Massimo about pretty much everything you just said about democracy and democracy. So.
And I get the impression that the audience agreed with you as well. That's it. We're going to go downstairs. The social hall, if you're not familiar with the building, go out, turn left, up another left, down the stairs.